section here for World History 2, and we're going to be dealing with the sort of last little bits of the 20th century and on into the 21st century for this one. So a lot of this discussion is going to be dominated by the Cold War, which lasts from 1946 through 1991. So we'll be talking about the influence that has on world events and how really it forces all major world events into kind of a well-worn channel, which is, what does this have to do with the Cold War? This conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union and their respective allies. And so we're going to be looking at this through a number of different flashpoints with this. But we're also going to be dealing with larger world events, such as events in the Middle East, the rise of essentially what is an Islamic form of nationalism, to put that into one of the three prongs that we've been discussing as major themes. We're going to be talking about the changes that will take place here in Europe with the adoption of democratic socialism. We're going to be dealing with worldwide changes in terms of the end of the Cold War, of modern conservatism in the United States with Ronald Reagan, what happens as a result of the end of the Cold War, and then all of these events leading up until eventually sort of the more modern kind of world events of today. To get this started, we're going to deal with the Potsdam Conference, right? And this is where the major world powers are going to gather together in Potsdam. They'd already had one meeting at Yalta to discuss, kind of what the world was going to look like following World War II. And then once Germany had finally surrendered, but Japan had not yet surrendered, we're going to see another meeting that's going to take place at Potsdam, which is just outside of Berlin, in 1945. The difference is at this meeting, we're going to have a couple of new players. Instead of President Roosevelt, who had died, we're going to see that Vice President Truman had been elevated to the position of the presidency for the United States. Clement Attlee party had actually won parliamentary elections in the UK, and he is going to replace Winston Churchill. The one stalwart in this group is actually going to be Stalin. Stalin at the Potsdam meeting is a very different guy than the Stalin at the Yalta meeting. Instead of, a team player and let's all sort of get along, Stalin now all of a sudden is pushing for a very strong role for the Soviet Union to adopt a high level of control over the areas that the Red Army has, as you referred to, liberated, right? He promises democracy, right? Attlee and Truman don't have much of a choice but to kind of acquiesce to what Stalin wants, but they do begin a period of pretty marked mistrust with the Soviet dictator. This was especially true for the U.S. president, Harry Truman, because he was an intuitive kind of person that wasn't particularly well-versed in terms of books and political theory and things like that, but he figured out pretty early on that Stalin was not a good guy, that he was not a trustworthy kind of individual, and this is going to sour their relationship very early on. Now, it turns out that Truman was dead on in that Stalin never truly planned for what most of us refer to as liberal freedoms in these countries. It never had the ideas of democracy and liberalism and things like that. Instead, he sees this as a moment to spread communism, particularly Moscow-run communism on a worldwide scale. So what's interesting here is he's a socialist, but he is in a lot of ways becoming kind of a national socialist in that he sees communism as a way to, or the victory of World War II as a way to export communism around the world as an adjunct of now fostering Soviet policy around the world, rather than simply meeting the needs of the workers and things like that. So this is the Potsdam Conference. There's Attlee, there's Truman, and there's Stalin, right? Wicked cool coat and pants from Stalin. I got to give him credit for that one. This is the table where they divide up parts of the world and who's going to get what and who's going to control different things. What we're going to see is Stalin's push for control of particularly Eastern Europe is going to create the phenomenon of what we call satellite nations. All these nations that his army had freed, right, they had set free from Nazi rule, are all going to turn into puppet states, meaning that they're basically going to do whatever Moscow tells them to do because their armies are occupying their country. And so we're going to see that between 1945 and 1948, all of these countries that had been liberated by Stalin's Red Army are all going to turn into communist countries by 1948. In some cases, it'll be through covert actions where they'll send in some agents, or there'll be some behind-the-scenes machinations where they'll make sure that elections kind of go their way, or in some cases just overt actions where Stalin makes sure that the only people who are available are communists. Now these countries are Czechoslovakia, Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia is sort of an independent kind of case, but it goes communist as well. Not necessarily a puppet state, but we don't have time to go into all of these different specific examples. But the West, when they view these events as they're happening, they see them kind of for what they are, which is blatant expansionism, that Stalin is using force to expand this communist rule, even if the people at home didn't necessarily want it. Well, regardless of whether or not you liked or disliked this, or what your opinion of this was, communist armies did take control of these places, and they turned them into police states, where if you disagreed with what was going on, you couldn't protest in public, you couldn't do these kinds of liberal kind of events where you spoke your mind, because they would just come and they would get you. And they would either throw you in jail, or they would put you in the gulag, or they would machine gun you, or whatever. And so this is what happens. You can see that the sort of the red tide of the Soviet communism is going to spread westward into Central Europe through the acquisition and the turning into puppet states of these satellite nations. One of the places that's going to get hit with this is going to be Germany itself. Now, the plan that the victorious Allied powers had agreed upon prior to the end of the war was that you need a Germany. You need a Germany. They're Germans, they're German people. Okay, we need one of those. But the problem with this was the boots on the ground situation at the end of World War II meant that the western two-thirds of Germany had been overrun by Britain and the United States and their allies, and then the eastern third, including the capital city of Berlin, had been captured by the Russians. And so if you wanted a united government where you're going to have one sort of form of government, either the U.S. is going to have to turn over its part to Stalin, or Stalin is going to have to turn over its part to the United States to administer under a single program, and neither one of these cases is going to take place. So, despite the fact that they had voiced the idea that their goal was to have a single Germany, it's not going to happen just because neither side is going to trust the other one. So the Soviets are going to wind up setting up East Germany as the DDR, the Deutsche Democratic Republic, right? The German Democratic Republic, despite the fact that it really wasn't democratic. It was a communist puppet state, all right? But West Berlin had been given over to the United States and the British and the French to administer during the days when they were still pals, because Berlin was the capital. Capital was an important city. But what that meant was, as relations with Russia soured ever more and more, you had this spot of West Berlin kind of surrounded by this ocean of communist-controlled territory. And so finally, in the late 1940s, Stalin decided we can't have this, and he cuts all the roads to West Berlin. The idea was that West Berlin would then starve. People would go to the grocery store and nothing would be there because they wouldn't be allowing food into the area. And so what the United States decided to do was they were going to repurpose a lot of those old World War II bombers that they didn't have any need for anymore, since they were no longer bombing people in World War II, and they started loading them up with food. And this was called the Berlin Airlift, and they flew them over Soviet territory, basically daring the Soviets to shoot them down. And if that had happened, then you have an act of war, and okay, Stalin, if you want World War III, here's your chance to do this. Well, the plan worked. The Berlin Airlift was able to bring in enough supplies to keep West Berlin stores stocked. It took a long time for this to kind of sink in, but Stalin was forced to admit defeat in this, and he eventually opened the roads to West Berlin. He still held power in most of communist Eastern Europe, but West Berlin is going to be an important outpost that the United States and other Western liberal nations are going to be able to use as kind of a thumb in the eye and say, look, this is what capitalism looks like. It isn't the bugaboo that the communists have told you about, and so this is going to be one of the important outposts that's going to eventually help lead to the end of communism in Eastern Europe. At this point, though, Winston Churchill, despite the fact that he's not in political power at this point, is still an important political figure, and he notes in a speech here in the United States that an iron curtain had descended across Europe, was keeping out all the light. Journalists couldn't go into this area and report on what they saw and then bring this back. It was a restriction of freedom, okay? And so behind that curtain, the communists could do whatever they want. They could suppress free elections, they could suppress free speech, they could nationalize industries, they could take control of whatever they wanted to, and so that's what you'll see here. So you get a little political cartoon right here. There's Churchill, he's still trying to peek under the Iron Curtain, which just kind of crashed right across the middle of Europe. at this point. All right. So what you're going to have as a result of this is the Cold War, right? By about 1948 or so, most of the American public, and actually the United States government a couple of years before, realized that communism was making a pretty overt attempt to conquer the world. And these guys that had been viewed as allies during World War II were now ever more seen as communist conquerors. The epithet that the U.S. government had used for propaganda purposes for why are we allied with a dictator like Stalin was Uncle Joe. He was Uncle Joe, right? He's that crazy uncle that gasses millions of people, you know. But he's our family, and so we're friends with him. So that was the idea that was kind of put across, that, you know, it was Uncle Joe Stalin. And ever increasingly, you're going to see that in the press and in official, you know, communications from the United States government as far as policy statements. No, he's not Uncle Joe anymore. In fact, ever increasingly, he's seen as a brutal dictator, and really, he's cast along the same kind of vein as Hitler, Mussolini, you know, those kind of guys. In 1949, one of the major shifts in the Cold War is going to shake the United States out of its complacency, and that is, following World War II, the United States had a trump card, and that was the atomic bomb. If the Soviets ever really got too far out of line, we just melt Moscow. You know, we just fly some bombers over their cities, over their armies, and we just nuke them, right? Because we've got nukes and they don't. Well, in 1949, the Soviets test their own atomic bomb, which means that any attempt to use nuclear force against the Soviet Union is going to be met by nuclear retaliation. Yeah, nuclear force is all fun and games until the nukes start coming back at you, right? So what this meant was, since nobody wanted any war to turn into a nuclear war, this conflict is going to have to find other channels rather than a direct military confrontation to express itself. Now, that doesn't mean that it's not a war. It's a war of ideologies. It's a war on a lot of levels, all right? And it's going to last until 1991, and it's called this Cold War because there's no direct military confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union. That doesn't mean there's no military conflict as part of it. It just means there's no direct military confrontation. The military confrontations are going to have to take place through proxies, such as Korea, Vietnam, and Afghanistan. So it's going to be fought on a lot of levels, ideological levels, economic levels, you know, economic competition, political, diplomatic. We'll have some honest-to-goodness James Bond espionage, you know, kind of moments. And the outcome is going to hinge on which mutually exclusive system of government is going to win. Are you going to have democratic capitalism? We're going to have liberalism, right? Or are we going to have communistic socialism? You can't have both. It's not like you can sort of, well, we'll sort of have communist capitalism, right? You're either going to have freedom or you're not, right? And this is going to dominate all major policy decisions by pretty much everybody until 1991 when it ends. The U.S. is going to begin the North Atlantic Treaty Organization to bring in allies to have a large opposition to any possible Soviet military attack. The Soviets are then going to bring in its satellite states in the Warsaw Pact to do pretty much the same thing. So this is 1945. There's Soviet soldiers in the east, there's American soldiers in the west. They meet along the Elbe River. They're shaking hands. They're happy to see each other because this means that they've kind of squished the Nazi war machine in between them. And so this looks like it's pretty close to the end of the war. And then all of a sudden, a few years later, you'll start seeing headlines like this, which is communism is the heir to fascism, right? And they're making all the links between how communism is actually similar to the Nazis and the fascists and people like that. The Soviets, of course, flexing their muscles in their May Day parades all throughout the 1940s and really up until 1991. Where they're, you know, running through Red Square with battalion after battalion of infantry, and they got their tanks and their rockets and their missiles and their artillery pieces, and this is designed to put on display just how big and powerful the Soviet military is. And then the political cartoonery of the day is going to give us pretty much the same kind of view, right? There's Stalin with these great big grubby, knuckly hands, and he's grabbed the world. Stalin as Caesar with the hammer and sickle chariot just crushing the masses beneath it, right? One of the major obstacles to any resistance by Western liberal Europe and North America to Stalin's advances was the fact that it was much of the opposition was going to be built on a pretty shaky economic foundation because immediately following World War II, the European economy was a wreck. The physical location was a wreck. The humanitarian situation was a wreck. You're going to see a lot of people were dislocated. They were living in displaced person camps because their cities had been bombed, had been fought through. A lot of people simply flee to the countryside when the fighting would approach their towns. Many of these towns are blown up, and so when you, even if the fighting moves on, you go back to your town, and there's nothing there, right? So a lot of these people are facing starvation here in the winter of 1945-46. And it looks like this may stick around for a while. It's going to be easy pickings for communist armies to come in because Western Europe isn't going to have the willpower or the ability to resist. The United States is going to step in to this diplomatic and economic vacuum with what it called the Marshall Plan. This was championed by Secretary of State John Marshall. He had been the top general for the United States during World War II and then kind of slid into the Secretary of State position after the war. Marshall's plan called on the United States to give millions of dollars to rebuild Europe's economy and put people back to work. All right, so the United States is going to invest its money here. Now, it's going to serve a couple of major purposes. One, it's going to aid the people there. There was a legitimate humanitarian concern. But two, you want to win friends. You want to win friends in what they thought was a coming showdown with Stalin. They would much rather these people side with the United States because, hey, we're helping you guys out, rather than to side with Stalin in this regard. Now, naturally, Stalin refused to allow this money to go to any of his puppet satellite states in Eastern Europe. And the reason for that was he didn't want them to be beholden to the United States, even though after several years it became patently obvious that the plan was very, very successful. All right. So here's an interesting way to try to break through this. Right. There's Uncle Sam and some of these other national characters telling the United Nations, right, give it a try, sister, right, to rip through the Iron Curtain. This map here gives you a good idea of where the money is going and how much. You can see that France and Britain gets the lion's share to sort of build up their defenses and get their economies working again. But the rest of Western Europe is going to get a pretty sizable chunk of change in order to build up its resistance to communism. And of course, nothing is going to take place here in Eastern Europe. There's Stalin. He's trying to block the shot of the Marshall Plan from going in the basket. Right? This is a couple of scenes of Stuttgart, one in 1947 after the war, and it looks pretty much like you expect a big industrial center in Germany to look, following World War II, which is blown up. Right? It's bombed out, and it's pretty well destroyed. Stuttgart had received pretty heavy aerial bombardment all throughout World War II. And this is the same scene. This is from the same spot, more or less, in 1955, just 8 years later. And it's a completely rebuilt city. You'd never know if I were to just show you these two pictures, right? Especially if you're following along in the slideshow, that this is the same city as that. You'd be like, no, those are two different cities, right? But no, it's exactly the same city, and it shows how successful the Marshall Plan really was. One of the other major events of the Cold War is going to take place, or really kind of come to a head, in 1949, and that is the end of the Chinese Civil War. Right? We had talked before about how Chinese communists, under the leadership of Mao Zedong, right, had been engaged in this civil war with essentially a series of warlords led by Chiang Kai-shek. They styled themselves the nationalists. But this is what had taken place, and these guys were at each other's throats, and this was part of the reason why Japan was able to invade a much larger country like China and take over huge chunks of Chinese territory. Well, once Japan, though, is defeated, when the United States drops a couple of atomic bombs and Japan surrenders, obviously part of the deal with the surrender was Japan is going to have to pull its forces out of China. Well, once that happens, the communists and the nationalists who had agreed on a sort of very tentative, we'll both fight the Japanese and not each other, kind of relationship, now that the Japanese have been removed, they can go back to their civil war, okay? One of the problems that Mao had was his real reliance. He had gone to Paris and he'd studied classical forms of European socialism. Was the idea that you've got to mobilize the industrial workers and you've got to get these urban areas with these workers on your side. But China didn't have a lot of industrialization, and the workers of these kind of areas, they were pretty few and far between. His message really fell flat in a lot of these urban areas. What's going to happen here is that after World War II, Mao's going to kind of retool his message into a more populist kind of socialism, where he mobilizes the rural areas against the large landowners. The idea of redistribution of wealth for rural workers as well. Well, when this happens, he's going to be much more successful now at mobilizing the countryside of class envy of rural workers because of China's large agricultural workforce. And that's going to make his armies much, much larger. Okay, so starting here in the post-World War II era, we're going to see that Mao's communist armies are going to be much more successful. And by this point, Chiang Kai-shek's forces are much less organized. Long story short, Mao's forces are going to drive Chiang's forces off the mainland and onto the island of Taiwan in 1949. Mao claims leadership over the entire country because other than Taiwan, he's pretty much got control of the country. Well, the Soviet Union is pretty quick to recognize the communist state as the legitimate government of all of China. Hey, the most populous country on earth has just gone communist, hooray, right? But the problem was the United States throughout World War II had regarded Chiang Kai-shek as the legitimate leader of China and in fact had supplied him with weapons and material and ammunition in order to help fight off the Japanese. So the United States regarded Chiang Kai-shek as the legitimate government of all China and said, no, no, Chiang's government, which is now based on Taiwan, that's the legitimate government of China. Eventually he'll get off Taiwan and he'll retake China. But that was the position the United States had, was that the government that had been forced onto Taiwan out of the needs of military exigency would eventually dominate the rest of China. I don't know about that, right? So and that's the political wrangling that takes place at the top level. When you bottom this out to, especially the effect this has on the U.S. public, they're pretty shocked. They're pretty shocked to see the most populous country on the planet go communist, especially after a series of reverses, 1946 through 1948, in Eastern Europe. This is also going to lead to communist China allying itself with another communist state, North Korea, that the Soviets had overrun in 1945 and established a communist puppet state there. Eventually, we're going to see the United States is going to have to fight a war in Korea to prevent a communist takeover of South Korea, which was a democratic government set up by the United States. And this is going to be the first of the several smaller proxy hot wars in the Cold War, and that's going to be the Korean War. And so here you can see a scene of Chairman Mao, right? This is how he very much wanted to project himself to the Chinese people, right? That he was this brilliant guy. You often see him with a piece of paper or like a briefcase or a clipboard or something like that. A lot of times it's rolled up plans. And the idea of, well, he's got a plan. And he's going to figure all this out. And what's going to happen as a result of the plan? Well, we're all going to have enough to eat. Right? There's food there. There's going to be hydroelectric dams. There's going to be cranes. There's going to be metal. There's going to be oil rigs. There's going to be factories. There's going to be trains. There's going to be trucks. There's going to be ships. We're going to have all this kind of stuff. This is the plan, right? And there's Chairman Mao inspecting many of this U.S. equipment that he had captured from Chiang. Chiang had received during World War II, so a little thumb in the eye to the United States, right? Here's a political cartoon of Stalin, right? He's taking China off the table now. He's adding it to Europe in the great poker game. This is a map to give you an idea of the fighting that takes place in the Korean War. North Korea invades the South, pushes the United States, catches it completely off guard. The United States counterattacks by actually going around the communist armies, landing at Incheon behind them on the peninsula, and then they fight their way northward, but then they get too close to the Chinese border in China. The Maoist government says, no, you guys can't get any closer. Well, the U.S. government doesn't have any relationship with Mao, and so they counterattack. They drive them all the way back down here, and then the fighting goes back and forth with this as well. Interesting scenes of fighting in Korea. Rugged, mountainous kind of terrain in a lot of places. Really, really cold in the wintertime. It's also the first war where you're going to see jet fighter engagement with one another. So here you can see a Russian MiG fighting a U.S. Saber Cat in the skies above Korea. And of course, while the Soviet Union was ostensibly, we were neutral, we're not involved in this. Of course, they're supplying all this equipment to the North Koreans and the Chinese, but also it was Russian pilots that were, for the most part, engaged in this kind of fighting. We're also going to see, just as another little point of interest in case any of you guys are interested, this is the first war the United States would fight integrated, racially integrated, other than the American, or since the American Revolution. So Truman's executive order desegregating the military is going to allow for this. This is the Marines going forward at Incheon. They got to scale up this rocky slope to counterattack these guys. And this is another map to give you an idea of kind of the back and forth, the stalemate kind of nature in the middle. This line is where the DMZ still is today. They just sort of call a stalemate here in 1953 when the fighting comes to an end, and so that's where things are basically left. As I mentioned, this is some Marines at Chosin Reservoir. It gets bitterly cold, especially during the Chinese counterattack here in 1950, and so it's rough kind of stuff. We're also going to see, when we go to not Eastern Asia, but Western Asia, one of the major problems that is confronting the people here in Europe is, what do we do with all these Jews? Hitler had tried to wipe them out in the Holocaust, but of course there were still many millions of more that were kind of in the pipeline to be exterminated when the war ended. And we're going to see that the horrors of the Holocaust, as it really kind of comes home, is going to hit a lot of people, both Jewish and non-Jewish, in a lot of different ways. one of the things that we're going to see within the Jewish community is it really gives a lot of fuel to the Zionist fire. Right? The Zionist movement had been something that had really picked up a decent amount of steam starting in the 1800s with Jews that had been spread by the diaspora into Europe. And this was the idea that a lot of Jews had been pushing forward, saying, we really need to move back to Israel. We really need to go back to Jerusalem. And this is where we're supposed to be. The Roman Empire that had kicked us out, centuries ago, isn't around anymore. And so we really need to start heading back. Of course, holding this back was the fact that a lot of Jews had kind of adapted to life in Europe and had developed careers and lives and villages. And so this is just, okay, this is where we are. And so the Zionist movement was kind of out there. The Holocaust really lights a fire under it in a way that not anything else had been able to do before, which is maybe we got to get out of Europe before these guys try to kill us again. Also, you have the fact of how do you move back to the town where you had lived in if you survived the Holocaust? How do you move back to the town where that you lived in, where you're surrounded by the people that turned you into the Nazis and said, yeah, these guys are the Jews, haul them off. So you've got a lot of personal baggage that's going to come with this, right? And really, in a lot of ways, a lot of people were looking in, non-Jews were looking inward at themselves as, how do we allow this to happen? Or in some cases, how do we participate in this happening, right? What's the recourse that we have to this? So really, in a lot of ways, as a form of apology, the United Nations, led in large part by the United States and Britain, are going to decide to allow the Jews to set up a Jewish state in Israel. Israel was still a protectorate of the British Empire. The United States had had a long sort of nudge with this and said, look, we need to do this. And they're going to start moving here in 1946 to set up a new Jewish state. So they will have a Jewish homeland. Hopefully, at least the idea was that you would be able to protect these people from anything like the Holocaust ever again. However, one of the things that's going to happen is you've got an influx now of essentially European people, right? This is really going to upset the economy and the power structure in the Middle East. It's going to drive up prices. These guys are going to come in, they're going to buy up land. The Arabs that have been living in the area, this is where we live and this is how we're doing things, and then all these Jews kind of come in. You do have the centuries-old hatred between Jews and Arabs, but a lot of this tension, right, is in fact going to be a larger political one where you've got, for the most part, autocratic dictators in the region that are going to view this liberal Jewish state of, for the most part, kind of European capitalists coming in, radically upsetting the balance. And then, of course, you throw the religious problem on top of that, and that's going to make for some pretty heated moments. The Israelis were forced to fight a war to drive the Arabs out of the country. And so you're going to have a war essentially to create Israel in 1946. And then you've got subsequent wars that break out in 1956, 1967, 73, and 74, and then again in 82. And these are going to take place between Israel and her neighbors that really refuse to accept the legitimacy of Israel. Of all of these that they wind up fighting, only Egypt is the one that came to say, okay, Israel, yeah, you have a right to exist. In many cases, the autocratic nations around Israel, the position still today is Israel's illegitimate and it has to be wiped out. Some are a little more vigorous in that statement than others, but generally speaking, you've got a lot of tension that remains today with a lot of Muslim fundamentalists that commit themselves to all kinds of violence against Israel and any of Israel's supporters, which of course includes the United States, because the United States is friends with really the only liberal nation in Southwest Asia, at least one that has a pretty long track record. And so here you can see some of the fighting. These are Arabs trying to fight off the Israelis coming into this area here in 1946. This is scenes from the 1950s wars of the Israelis versus the Arabs around them. This is the UN partition plan where the Jews would get the part here in this kind of orange, and then the purple is going to be the parts that would be the proposed Arab state. And you still have this major problem of even today, well, who gets what where, right? And whether or not there will ever be sort of a full, whether there will be a full sort of solution to all this is one of the great questions of today. The nation of Israel, of course, has another major problem in the fact that it's essentially the size of New Jersey. And it's completely surrounded by people that, for the most part, want to wipe it out. And so their military has to be ready at a moment's notice. They've got a lot of people, the Arabs within their borders that don't particularly want to be a part of Israel. And so there's a lot of fighting. There's a lot of dislocation of persons. Who's going to take them? And so anyway, it's a very complicated kind of issue. But there's a lot of bad feelings on all sides. This is the counterattack by the Israelis in the 1972 war against the Egyptians. The Egyptians attack them, the Israelis counterattack, and they take the Sinai Peninsula. This is some scenes of that kind of fighting. There's a Russian-made T-72 tank for the Egyptians that gets knocked out, and so these are some other Russian tanks that are going to get used. And so very modern kind of war fought with sort of ancient animosity behind it. As you go from the 1950s into the 1960s, and we talk about the shift of the Cold War and how that begins to evolve over time, one of the major changes is going to take place in 1953 when Joseph Stalin dies. And as I mentioned before, one of the things that you don't have as a dictator is a vice dictator. You want to keep it kind of murky as to who your successor is, so that way they don't just knife you, take you out, and then say, hey, everybody knew that he wanted me to succeed him when he died, and well, he's dead now, so I'm the dictator. I can do whatever I want. Eventually, we'll see that Nikita Khrushchev, a guy who had distinguished himself in the party, but also as a party officer, as one of the major commissars at the Battle of Stalingrad in 1942 and 43, he eventually is going to win this power struggle, and he's going to become the premier of Russia here a few years later. Right? Now, Khrushchev says that he's going to have a more open style. He repudiates the harsh measures of Stalinism, the gassings of people and the murders and wiping out whole villages and killing off the generals in the army and stuff like that. But when people try to leave the communist orbit, like Czechoslovakia and Hungary, he sends in his military. Right? Prague Spring gets crushed. Right? The Hungarian People's Movement here in Budapest in 1956, they get crushed. Right? The tanks go in and they just get smashed. Now the idea is that they had, well, we're going to still do communism. We're just going to have more open forms. Khrushchev's like, no, you're going to do what we say, and if you don't like it, you get squished. Okay? In 1959, we're going to see that a very anti-American revolutionary named Fidel Castro, who had been fighting a long-standing civil war against Fulgencio Batista, he's going to win. He's going to win this civil war. Castro's going to take charge. Right? His little guerrilla movement is going to succeed. Okay. After that happens, Castro says, oh, by the way, I'm a communist. Okay, right? What this means now is this is a major strategic problem for the United States because Cuba is just 90 miles off the Florida coast, and so now you have potential communist outposts right next door to the United States. And we'll see that when it comes to launching nuclear missiles, this is going to be a particular point of problem. We're also going to see that the Russians, along with the United States, one of the major activities in the waning days of World War II was grabbing everything that they could of value from Germany before really their opponents could possibly do so. And one of the major things that both of these guys went after were scientists. The Germans really produced an impressive number of scientists that, in part due to their lack of feeling bound to humanitarian ideas, really had pushed the folds of science in some cases to some unethical areas. Well, one of the more ethical areas that they had worked on was in rocketry. And the V-1 and V-2 rockets that Hitler, of course, would turn into sort of flying bombs are going to be these projects a lot of these guys had worked on to escape Earth's gravity and go into orbit. Well, the Russians had grabbed some of these guys. The Americans had grabbed some of these guys. The United States, under President Eisenhower, had never really pursued much of a space program. They didn't want to upset the Russians by orbiting over their country and things like that. The Russians had absolutely no qualms about this. And they're going to be the first ones to put the first object in orbit, and that's a satellite named Sputnik. Now, Sputnik went around the Earth a few times and it emitted these radio beeps, but it scared the crap out of the American citizens because, of course, if you could put satellites in space, what else can you put in space? And the United States, of course, has no counter to that, at least not initially. It's not going to be until really the 1960s that the United States is going to have much of a space program to speak of to counter the Russians. Eventually, they would surpass the Russians. But that's going to take some time. There are Russian tanks and the Russian troops. Yay, we crushed the protests in 1956. I mean, these guys armed with, I don't know, bouquets of flowers. I don't know what these protesters had. They definitely didn't have any Joseph Stalin tanks to match up with these guys. And so it's a pretty ugly affair that takes place. There is Castro, right? He's making another one of his bombastic speeches. If you get a chance and you ever want to have some fun, do an image search for Castro. He always looks dirty. He just looks like he's never had a bath in his life. I don't know what the deal is with that. Definitely needs to shave, but he declared that he wouldn't shave anymore because he'd been a guerrilla fighter. bathing and shaving and stuff is what he does. So there's Sputnik, right? I don't know if it looks scary to you, but it definitely scared a lot of Americans in the 1950s. When you get into the 1960s, our new sort of combatant is still going to be Khrushchev for the Russians, but we are going to have a new entrant, and that's going to be John F. Kennedy for the United States. He was very much a Cold Warrior, did not like communism, was very vigorous in his opposition to the expansion of communism. And Cuba is going to be one of the major sore spots for the Kennedy administration. Kennedy had ordered an attack on the island that was going to be led by anti-Castro Cuban exiles. The United States was going to drop these guys off in the Bay of Pigs. They were going to go in and topple Castro's government. Well, the invasion is going to fail. And this is going to give the Kennedy administration kind of a black eye. But when you look at it from the perspective of Castro, Castro had come to the opinion that, hey, the United States is coming to kill me. And that's actually what the United States was trying to do. And so what that did was that pushed Castro much closer to the Soviet Union and said, hey, Soviets, hey, Russia, you guys like having a communist outpost right on America's doorstep? Then you need to send some reinforcements and beef up defenses on the island. Well, Khrushchev's interpretation of how to best to defend Cuba was start placing nuclear missiles on Cuba pointed at the United States. What this meant was this threatened most major American cities within atomization within minutes of launch. All right? President Kennedy discovered these using spy planes, and he went on national TV and he made a big stink about it and demanded their withdrawal. He quarantined and blockaded the island of Cuba and said, okay, no more nuclear missiles are going to be delivered. You got to start taking these out. This is not defensive. You guys are pointing at our cities, and when you launch them, we won't have any opportunity to evacuate. We won't be able to do any of that kind of stuff, right? Well, for a couple of weeks, the world is going to stand on the edge of nuclear war. And if you ever, when you were a kid, ever played that game, where you stare at each other and the first person who blinks loses? Well, in this case, it's going to be Kennedy versus Khrushchev. And it's going to be really, really ugly, right? A lot of people are very tense about the whole thing. People were digging bomb shelters in their backyards and things like that because they thought the nukes were going to start falling at any minute, right? Because Kennedy said that any attack from Cuba is going to be regarded as an attack from Russia. We're going to start nuking them. They're going to start nuking us, right? That kind of thing, right? We'll see that Khrushchev is going to be the first one to blink. He's going to back down. He'll remove the missiles. They do go through the diplomatic kind of fan dance with what they're going to do, right? But a lot of people realize that the world had come perilously close to a nuclear exchange, okay? Now, the crisis is going to show Kennedy's resolve in dealing with this. But it also causes Soviets to really look introspectively and say, okay, what are we going to do? What if it actually comes to some kind of a military standoff with the United States? And what that means is they start diverting more and more resources, especially by the mid to late 1960s, towards their military research, military expansion, beefing up the number of troops that they have in Eastern Europe. That also is going to have a concomitant fallout effect, which is more resources for the military in a socialist regime. It means less resources for the people, because people don't, they don't work harder to make extra. They just work the same amount, and they get what they get from the government. And so this is one of the maps you would have seen, right? The medium range ballistic missile, the intermediate range ballistic missile, and where they could hit. And so something, I don't know, it's like 12 minutes from Cuba to DC, or I forget what the time scale was. But they could hit pretty much anywhere with these missiles based in Cuba. This is the actual U-2 photo that Kennedy showed on national TV, and then also at the United Nations, where the missiles were, all these various sites and things like that. This is the confrontation between Adlai Stevenson and the Russian ministers, where he's demanding them, hey, what do you guys say about these missiles you got in Cuba? And of course the Russian, the guy says, hey, I don't have to answer your question. We need to go on to the next speaker. You'll get a report from my government when it's ready to answer these questions. And the next guy said, actually, I want to hear what the Americans have to say. So Stevenson basically gets as much time to press the issue as he wants, and he tells the Russians on national TV, I'm prepared to wait for your answer until hell freezes over. So this is a pretty tense kind of moment. And there you can see Russian tanker with a belly full of nuclear missiles trying to get to Cuba. It's being headed off by a U.S. destroyer and a U.S. bomber, letting them know that, no, you're not going to be able to get more missiles into Cuba. So really, really tense kind of moment, all right? We're also going to see that the second of the three major flashpoints, major hot points of the Cold War is going to take place in Vietnam. And what you've got in Southeast Asia is a country that had been colonized by the French and then the Japanese come in and kick out the French during World War II, and you'll see a strong insurgent movement. A nationalist leader, a guy named Ho Chi Minh, is going to be leading resistance against the Japanese because he wants an independent Vietnam. Well, Japan is defeated by the United States, and the Japanese leave. Yay! But then the French come back. Oh! The French insist on reinstituting their colonial policy, and so Ho Chi Minh is forced to now fight another war of liberation, this time against the French. Ho actually had a pretty high opinion of the United States. In a lot of circles, he was known as the George Washington of Vietnam, and you would think that the United States would be kind of, lenient on the guy. We understand what he's trying to do, independence movement and all that kind of stuff. The problem with this, though, was Ho was a communist. He's a communist. And also the guys that he's fighting are the French. And the United States, they really need France on their side in what they think is going to be an upcoming showdown with the Soviet Union. And so they back French colonial efforts. Okay, you guys want to colonize, what they call Indochina, Vietnam, fine. You guys go for it. We're cool with that, right? So, long story short, the Ho's forces do to the French basically the same thing that Hitler's forces did to him. Smashed them up real bad and forced them to surrender at a place called Dien Bien Phu, right? And so the United States is shocked at this. They don't want to see any more expansion of communism. They've just gone through this period in the 1940s and on the 1950s where communism was on the march. And so what they do is they come to an agreement and they say, okay, well look, North Vietnam, the part next to China, that could be communist. South Vietnam is going to be administered by the United States and is going to be democratic, okay? And we'll eventually reunify the country. We'll do this kind of thing, where it'll come back together and we'll come to an agreement everybody can understand. The problem that the United States had, you would normally say, well, why does he have an election? Just let Ho run for president. By far, Ho was the most popular guy. The United States knew that Ho would probably win in this kind of area. Well, as tensions began ratcheting up here, the North Vietnamese are going to oblige the United States as a sort of bloodlust in this regard by firing on a U.S. warship, the Maddox. There's a lot of controversy around the Maddox incident. We're just going to assume, for the sake of simplicity, that it actually got shot at. If you want to look into it a little more, feel free. But whatever, the way that it was pointed to the Congress was, okay, President Johnson goes forward and he says, I need more power to fight, expand the fighting in Vietnam, and Congress basically writes him a blank check. Sure, go do whatever you have to do, okay? What you're going to see is the United States, prior to that, had a number of advisors, right? And a lot of these guys were special forces guys. But it was a relatively low number. And instead of fighting, a special forces kind of war, the United States, under Johnson, decides to fight a World War II kind of war, where thousands of U.S. ground and air and naval forces are going to start going into Vietnam to protect South Vietnam from incursions by these Viet Cong irregulars that are working their way into South Vietnam. Now, Russia naturally supported Ho, right? Started sending supplies, AK-47s, Kalashnikovs, Pepe Shaw submachines, all that kind of stuff. To these guys, right? The fighting proved to be a pretty devastating experience for the United States soldiers. They're really, not so much when it came to the fighting, because once it came down to actual fighting, the United States was actually pretty good at that. They had good technology, they had good organization, good lines of supply, but the problem really was in locating, who's the enemy and who's not, right? How do we deal with communist Viet Cong infiltrators that were hiding amongst the civilian population, or were hiding in dense jungles or in cave systems? Who do we shoot at? Who do we not shoot at? Who do we grab and throw in the back of the truck and haul off, and who do we leave there? So what you're going to see is the United States is going to wind up fighting civilians as well as the Viet Cong, and the fighting turns into what the newspapers call a quagmire. The United States was fighting a very open-ended kind of war with a very ill-defined political goal, and of course you have evaporating support for the war at home. The problem when you look at Vietnam from the U.S.'s point of view, okay, is how do you know if you're winning or not? I mean, one of the things that people like to know if they're going to be asked to expend the blood of their young men and the treasure of their nation is, what are we going to get out of this? How do we know if we're succeeding? And so in World War II, it was pretty easy. You just put the flags on the map. As Patton's army is advancing, for example, the closer it gets to Berlin, the closer the victory is. Right? Eventually, at some point, when we overrun Germany and we drag Hitler's dead body through the streets, hooray, we win. Right? This case, you're not going to do it. You're not invading North Vietnam. You're not knocking out Ho's government in North Vietnam. Right? you're just defending South Vietnam from these waves of Viet Cong infiltrators. How do you know when they're going to stop doing that? Well, you kill them all, I suppose. So they did the body count, kind of war. When are they going to give up? Okay. We're going to see that one of the tipping point moments of this is going to be the Tet Offensive in 1968. And the reason for this is not necessarily from military issues. Right? It was a North Vietnamese surprise attack. One of the things that they felt had really gone over pretty well in the previous years, these Viet Cong infiltrators really kind of softened these guys up. And they were now ready to kind of come out. They sent these guys out and, in their formations, and they sent out the tanks and they sent the aircraft with this. And it was a surprise attack that initially caught the United States off guard. And you'd see a lot in the media, of Saigon being attacked and various places, all of a sudden being assaulted. Now, eventually, one of the things that would happen is the U.S. military would recover from this. It's like, oh, okay, all right, you guys hit us, but now you're out in the open. That's exactly where we want you. You're not hiding in places that we can't find you. The bombs are going to start coming down. The tanks are going to start coming out. And from the military point of view, this is a crippling defeat for the North Vietnamese. From a political point of view, this is a crippling defeat for the United States. Because a lot of people who are watching this war on television, they come to the conclusion that President Johnson's lying to us. We're not winning the war. If we were winning the war, they wouldn't launch this major offensive and catch us off guard. This is not what countries that are about to lose a war do. So this is Vietnam, for those of you who have never seen it. It's a long, thin strip of territory on the eastern edge of the Indochina Peninsula. There's China up there, right? There's the Straits of Malacca down that way in Indonesia. There you go. And so here you can see the U.S. forces that are on patrol. They're in the jungles, right? They're going through the rice paddies. Many of these places are so remote that they're only accessible by a helicopter. They're going to be fighting in the towns and the villages of this as well. And of course, as you grab these people, the North Vietnamese and the South Vietnamese, they all look the same. They all speak the same language. So how do you tell when they're all wearing civilian clothes, which ones are the Viet Cong and which ones are just the South Vietnamese people that are letting them stay in their village because they don't want to get shot? It's pretty hard to tell, right, with this. And so that's what's going on. You're also going to see that, how do you deal with a nation that has all these planes in the sky? We hide underground, right? There's a good way to get in and out. You dig these pits, you dig these caves, you slide in under the water, wherever else it is that you can get in and out. And so you're also going to see that this becomes very much a propaganda war. The United States, these guys are receiving fire from this village, so finally they've had enough of getting shot at. They call in a napalm strike. We're going to hit everybody in the village with a napalm strike, including these little kids who have their skin melted off, right, as a result of this. And so they're terrified, as a result of this. This doesn't exactly, endear the South Vietnamese people to the United States. You're also going to see our allies, our erstwhile allies in the South, they're executing this guy on national TV. If you want to look up this is a still of video footage of this guy. He's what was his name? He was an irregular, wearing civilian clothes. And so, when you're not dressed in your military uniform, you're not under Geneva Convention protections, and so you're fighting for an enemy, and so you're just subject to apparently summary execution. And this guy shot him. This colonel for the South shot this guy, and it was caught on TV. Regardless of whether it was right or wrong, makes the United States look bad. Right? Eventually, the United States is going to sort of wash its hands of the Vietnam debacle and is going to pull its forces out. All right. So what we're going to see as we get into the 1970s, this worldwide kind of conflict, is going to cause a great deal of introspection for the United States following Vietnam. All right. President Nixon is going to lead the way in what is often referred to as the period of détente, right, which is a cooling off of the Cold War tensions, led by Henry Kissinger, who's going to push for an idea of realpolitik, which is realistic approaches to the Cold War, such as, hey, if Vietnam goes communist, who actually cares? Who cares if they're communist rice paddies in Vietnam rather than capitalist ones, right? Now, we need to pay attention to Russia, we need to pay attention to China, but getting sucked into a war where 57,000 Americans are killed to keep communism out of South Vietnam, a lot of people, why do we care, with this kind of thing? So, one of the things that the Nixon administration tried to do was to deal much more openly with communism and try to cool off these Cold War tensions and say, okay, look, communists have control of Russia, they have control of China, we need to deal with that fact. We need to treat them like countries, and we're gonna do this. For this, Nixon is going to recognize Mao's government in China and is actually going to visit. He's going to visit, he's going to open up trade relations. This is why when you go to the store today, you find everything made in China. Boom! This is why this is going to happen like that. He's also going to visit Moscow. He's going to help broker some limits on nuclear weapons. We're going to see that later presidents in the 70s, President Carter, he's going to continue these limits with the SALT treaties, right? So on the one hand, we're going to see that the United States is trying to calm things down, right? That inflexibility, towards communism, this sort of, knee-jerk response. Oh, it's communist, we got to fight it. Had led to the Vietnam debacle, right? But in a lot of ways, we're also seeing that the United States is trying to play its hand very deftly in separating Chinese communism from Russian communism. Throughout the 1960s, China and Russia had actually fought a border war against each other because China is too big of a country to be a puppet of Moscow. Czechoslovakia, Poland, right? These countries, they could be taken over by the Soviets pretty easily. North Korea could be pretty heavily influenced by the Soviet Union. But China can't. China's too big. So the question is, which form of communism is going to be the dominant communism? And so the United States is looking at this and saying, here's an opportunity for us to say, well, we're going to be friends with one of these groups and not with the other. So this is an opportunity to kind of drive a wedge between China and the Soviet Union. So there's Nixon, and he's shaking hands with Chairman Mao, right? And for a guy who is vehemently as anti-communist as Nixon, I don't know if it's like a skin melted off on his hands or not, but that's what happened. He got to tour the Great Wall, right? Go to the Great Wall of China, right? Pretend to like Chinese food while he's there, right? Watch a lot of ping pong. This is him arriving in Moscow. He's going to meet the Russian premier, and this is the Russian, honor guard pretending to like the fact that the U.S. president is there in their country, right? So when you look at this from the point of view, though, of the Soviets in the 1970s. The message that the United States is trying to send is, hey, look, let's calm things down, let's be pals, right? And a lot of us today, if you like peace and you don't like bombs falling everywhere, a lot of us sort of nod, yeah, that's a good idea. Let's try to be friends with people if we can, right? The way that this position that was portrayed in the Soviet Union was, U.S. has gone soft. The only reason they're trying to be pals now is because they are ripe for the picking, right? They've been defeated in Vietnam. This is a sure sign of weakness. We're trying to go after these guys, okay? And so by the end of the 1970s, the Russians had begun this massive troop buildup in Western Europe, something like 85 divisions, threatening West Germany especially. Now, the Russians also throughout this period were exporting a great deal of military technology to basically anybody who would buy it. And this is going to somewhat bolster their economy, all right? When NATO looks to the United States for leadership, but you're also going to see that by 1979, the U.S. is embroiled in its own series of crises. And so there's Russian T-72 tank, still basic chassis that the Russians are using for a long, long time after that. The Hind attack helicopter, sometimes referred to as a flying tank because of how hardy it is in the sky. We're going to see that Russian nuclear submarines are ranging off at this point the U.S. coast, threatening them with nuclear annihilation at a moment's notice. When you look at Western Europe and sort of all of Western civilization in North and South America as well, generally turning their governments, generally the people here are turning towards their governments for social support following World War II. This is going to put a great deal of strain on these political parties because the government was generally pretty effective at providing services. One of the things that government is not good at doing is getting things done, especially in the domestic kind of scale. They kind of collect taxes and do a few things, but when they're asked to run the trains and the hospitals and the steel mills and all this kind of stuff to make sure that it's all fair and apportioned out, they're not very good at this kind of thing. It's also going to mean that there's going to be some higher taxes on these democratic socialist states, and when you have really, really high taxes, you're going to have depressive economic effects. So you're going to have less of a urge to earn more money when most of it's going to get soaked up away from you in taxes. You'll see, for example, France is going to fail or suffer from a series of failed governments throughout the 50s and 60s. Even the World War II hero for France that kind of kept the light of French independence burning, Charles de Gaulle, he was forced out of office in the face of a series of economic crises. All right? We're also going to see protest movements are going to mark much of the Western world in the 60s and 70s for a number of causes. You're going to see social justice for races, for feminist movement for women, governmental transparency, ecological movements for the environment. You're going to see that a lot of massive protests are going to be found in a lot of these places as well. So this is President de Gaulle, and I don't know that I really like this photo of him. If you're clicking along, to me he kind of looks like Dracula. He's really kind of a pasty guy. De Gaulle had fought in World War I. He'd been captured at Verdun I think fairly early on in the fighting, and so he served out the rest of the war as a POW. And then he fights again as a general in World War II, manages to escape, and leads the Free French forces in opposing Hitler everywhere that he can. And then eventually gets himself elected president of France as a result of that. And so here you can see a little presidential cartoon making fun of the fact that de Gaulle is the maypole, and all these political figures just wrapping their ribbons around him in their little springtime festival. All right. Major game changer in terms of not only U.S. policy but also overall Cold War policy is going to be the dual ascension to power of Ronald Reagan in the United States and Margaret Thatcher in Great Britain. The case study we'll use for this is U.S. President Reagan. He's going to defeat the then sitting President Carter, and he's going to push for a lot of changes in U.S. policy. The most global of which is to scrap this idea of détente and to confront Soviet power directly. Okay, he calls the Soviet Union the evil empire. Okay, and he begins a very large U.S. weapons buildup. This is going to cause a great deal of consternation for a lot of people who say, no, don't make fun of the Soviets. They'll get mad. They'll try to attack us. You're going to start World War III. He's often referred to as a cowboy, his sort of spurs are jangling. He's just itching for a fight. He ratchets up the tension even more. He goes to the Berlin Wall, and he actually challenges the Soviet premier, Mikhail Gorbachev, to tear down this wall. The Berlin Wall, preventing people from escaping to the freedom of West Berlin, had become a symbol of the fact that, hey, look, communism is basically just a big prison. They got to build walls to keep their people in. Okay, he begins a weapon system in space, supposedly to shoot down Russian nuclear missiles. This was called the Strategic Defense Initiative, the SDI. It was nicknamed Star Wars after the popular series of sci-fi films. Also, it was not real. This was Reagan faking the Russians, but it was a very successful fake in that the fact the Russians spent a lot of money in trying to find ways to counter it. Okay. Now, as I mentioned, a lot of people were afraid that Reagan was going to lead the West into this massive nuclear war in a World War III with the Russians, but Reagan's calculation was that the more that the Russians are forced to spend on the military, the more quickly they will go broke and not be able to provide basic needs for their citizens, and there will be a revolution inside Russia. So essentially he reverts back to the old Truman position of containment. You contain them where they are, and eventually, because communism is immoral, the people will riot from within and they will pull it down. There's Ronald Reagan, right? This is him, right? This is him standing before the Berlin Wall, demanding that it be taken down. Now, on the other side of the coin, when we look at how this is playing itself out in Russia, we got to look at Mikhail Gorbachev, all right? And he is the Soviet leader, right? And by 1984, the Soviet government is going to attempt to appease America. They had tried this kind of hardline approach with America, and that hadn't worked out. And so, okay, what this means is they're going to appoint a more the Politburo, the communist leadership. They're going to appoint a conciliatory leader named Mikhail Gorbachev, right? And Gorbachev's going to meet fairly frequently with Reagan. They're going to talk out their issues a little bit more, although Reagan does walk out on one of these meetings because he says, okay, the Russians aren't serious about this. But they do talk about peace and improving the relations, but the world is still pretty nervous that this guy Reagan's going to cause all these problems. Gorbachev is going to try to deal with these issues in a very different way. He's going to institute a couple of programs called Glasnost and Perestroika, where you're going to increase the openness of the Soviet government a little, and give people a little bit more liberal freedoms in measured amounts, right? Gorbachev, though, does have to spend more on the military to try to keep pace with the U.S. Military buildup, both the real parts and the imaginary parts, all right? The USSR, though, as a result of this spending, begins to visibly weaken, okay? By the late 1980s, it was pretty obvious that the threat of kind of the veiled, hammer falling down on them from Moscow was starting to crumble, okay? And there's Gorbachev with his trademark little spot on his head, and it kind of looks like a hammer a little bit, or Australia, or something, right? So what that means is by 1989, the Soviets are, when more anti-communist protests begin to move up, we're going to see that the Soviets are not able to quell these like they had in previous decades, okay? And so these anti-communist movements in these satellite nations are going to start swelling up, and they're going to take on a life of their own. And we're going to see that by 1989, Gorbachev is forced to allow them to leave communist influence. All right. In Germany, specifically, the East German communist government there, which essentially are puppets of the Russians. Okay? They allow the Berlin Wall to come down, and East Berliners now can stream into West Berlin, and they can see what capitalism looks like, and what it looks like is clean streets, lights, cars that work, stores that are full of food, and when they head back to East Berlin, they're mad. They're angry because they see an East Berlin that looks almost the same that it did in 1945 when the war ended. There's still bullet holes in the walls, okay? A lot of places that are still destroyed. Communism didn't work. The people were miserable. They were told that it was the only way to keep things fair. You don't want capitalism because it's unfair. And then they go to the West and they see what capitalism actually looks like, and they realize they've been lied to. Okay? By the end of the year, Eastern Europeans all across these areas demand an end to communist practices. They take to the streets, and we're going to see that communism falls completely by the wayside of these satellite nations. The Russians at this point can only watch. They pull their tanks, they pull their forces out of these areas, and this is the best that they can do. This is the Polish Solidarity Movement, led by Lech Walesa in Poland. Eventually in 1989, this is going to help topple Polish communism. This is Riga, Latvia, and the Baltic states, or actually Estonia is going to be the place where this is going to start, tiny little Baltic state, then it's going to spread to all of Eastern Europe. With this is what Prague looked like on the streets in 1989, where these people are demanding an end to communism, and eventually it would fall apart. This is East Berlin in 1989. And this is the wall coming down in that same year, and the East Berliners are going to be heading west. By August of 1991, really the USSR was kind of on life support, right? They're in a hospital, they got the tubes in. The economy was really starting to fall apart internally, and the few freedoms that Perestroika had offered to the Russian people, instead of keeping them kind of happy and saying, okay, well, we want communism to continue because we're getting a little bit of freedom. Instead, what it meant was, hey, we get a little bit of freedom, let's get some more, right? It's sort of like giving a little bit of oxygen to a drowning person. They don't say, oh, okay, well, I'll just stay here in the water, I get a little bit of oxygen. No, now I have the energy to fight to get to the surface and get some more. We're going to see that a lot of people within the Communist Party didn't like this drift that Gorbachev had kind of taken the country, that it was opening up and it was a little bit more liberal. They said, no, we need to go back to the old Stalinist, kind of hard line thing, which is you people get back to work or we'll shoot you, okay? So we're going to see a coup against Gorbachev. They're going to grab him when he's at his little summer house, and they're going to spirit him off. And what you're going to see is the people then take to the streets. They protest the coup. No, we kind of like Gorbachev. We want Gorbachev back. While they're out in the streets, hey, you know what? While we're out here, let's get rid of communism. Yeah, communism does suck. Yeah, communism is pretty awful. And so it turns very, very quickly into massive anti-communist protests. Well, the Russian Communist Party sends in the army. They send in the Red Army, and these guys are going in. And I remember, watching this on TV as a teenager. Oh, here it comes. I'd seen this kind of thing before. People protest communism, they get smashed, right? The tanks come in, the soldiers come in, and they refuse to put down the protests. Many of these guys had not been paid in months, and they realize, oh, do we really want to shoot our own people? Nah, right? And so we're going to see that the Soviet Union just simply ceases to exist. It's poof, it's over, right? The West is going to win the Cold War. And here you can see the civilians are climbing on the tanks that have been shut down by the soldiers. And they're going to take over the streets. And that's it. It just kind of ends, right? There's no climactic battle. We're going to see that one of the things that begins to thaw in Europe is nationalism. Nationalism had been, if you dial the clock back to, from the 1990s to the 1890s, nationalism was one of these fervent kind of things. It had been virulent in some cases, especially on the eve of World War I, where they're cheering that they're going to be slaughtering other people in different nations because we're going to prove how awesome we are, right? You fast forward 100 years, right, to the 1990s, and we're going to see that national Europe is beginning to subside enough for Europeans to seek greater economic and political hegemony or homogeneity on their continent. They realize, okay, this is a good time for us to kind of, communism is gone. A lot of the national differences are kind of dividing us up. They need to go away for better economic relations, better political relations, okay? And so I find it ironic that the place where modern nationalism gets its start and then gets exported to places like China and South America and Africa is the place where it begins to wane the largest. So all throughout the latter half of the 1900s, we'll see this movement towards the European Union. It officially gets started here in the 1960s with the idea of uniting Europe under one kind of leadership. The Union doesn't become much of a functioning body, though, until the 1990s. And even today, European Union isn't a total real thing. I mean, it kind of operates on an economic level. There are certain things that it can do. There's certain things that it can't do. If you think of the European Union as a United States of Europe with a federal system where you got one sort of leadership at the top and then you got, you know, a different country, no, it's not that formal with that. They do share money. They do that kind of thing, right? And in the 1990s, this is when the Europeans, though, are going to drop their trade and travel barriers. They're going to adopt a single currency, the euro, and they actively work to drop these trade barriers with other nations as well. They're still looking for a single political leadership, though, and there's a lot of wrangling about how to allow poor nations into or out of the European Union. Britain, of course, is watching this kind of from a distance, not too far from a distance. But they don't actively participate in all the things of the European Union. So, and this is a euro, for those of you that want to go over and get some of these, in case the currency ever crashes, which it might at any point. Now, this is what it looks like. So it's roughly analogous to the U.S. dollars and things like that, and how it operates, right? One of the things that the Cold War had prevented from happening was a lot of local wars that didn't have anything to do with the Cold War. The communists of the United States are looking at these problems and they're going to say, oh, well, this doesn't have anything to do with communism or anti-communism, so we're not going to allow this to happen. So you'll see, for example, in Yugoslavia, right, the communist dictator Tito had just these these Serbs, the Croats, the Slavs, the Christians, the Muslims, right? They had not allowed them to fight each other because we're going to have peace and we're going to have order. You guys want to fight each other, then forget it. Just send in the tanks and squish people. So what that had done is really suffocated a lot of national hatred that might have normally sort of worked itself out, maybe in a violent way, but still would have happened. And so this suppression means that once you remove this barrier, once this Cold War kind of blanket that's been smothering all this is removed, we're going to see that this hatred that had been smoldering is going to be allowed to go into full flame. So in most of these cases, you're going to see ethnic and or religious differences are going to explode in the wake of 1991. Now, these wars are going to be limited in scope to geographic areas, but are going to be brutal within their own sphere. And so this is what you're going to see. These killing fields are going to take place in southeastern Europe, where these different ethnic groups are going to be at each other's throats. They've been hating each other for a long, long time, right? The best example of this is going to be the fighting that takes place inside Bosnia. As I mentioned, the Russian communist, the old communist state of Yugoslavia is going to break up into its nationalistic components after the fall of the USSR in 1991, and it's actually going to continue breaking up into smaller and smaller units as a result of what takes place as this series of crises go on. Right? Now, the problem is, of course, is the units are not homogeneous. We've looked at enough of those maps of Europe to realize that just because you draw a circle around an area and say, okay, this is Serbia, not everybody that lives there are going to be Serbs. They're going to have little pockets of all these different groups, different ethnicities within them, right? So you'll see that the Serbs embark on this campaign to reunite Yugoslavia and purge these non-Serbs by what they called ethnic cleansing, right? Which was nothing more than just, it was outright mass murder, right? The Holocaust, you could say, was ethnic cleansing, right? It's just murder, they're just killing people, okay? Now NATO eventually is going to have to intervene twice with bombing to end the violence, but about 200,000 Balkan people died. It's ridiculously heinous how bad this kind of thing is going to take place. So this is what we're going to be looking at here. It's a tiny little country. It's the rest of Europe. And the red spot is going to be one of our flashpoints in the Balkans. And you can see the map, the shatter belt of how it happens. You got Croatia, Bosnia, Herzegovina, Serbia, right? Macedonia, and this kind of area. So this is what takes place there. Now this is the ethnic map where you can see these little pockets of these different people from all over the place. With this. And these are the mass graves of these people that are herded off and just shot. Another example of nationalism flaring itself up in the post-Cold War world is going to be a religious form of nationalism. And that is going to take place in the form of international Muslim extremist terrorism, right? Our main character for this for a long time is going to be Osama bin Laden, right? And he's the leader of the Mujahideen, or one of the leaders of Mujahideen forces in Afghanistan in the 1980s. The Russians had invaded Afghanistan, and the United States was supplying the Mujahideen as sort of the counter to the American experience in Vietnam. They're going to be helping out the Afghans fighting off the Russians. And it's going to be a successful campaign. Eventually the Russians are forced to pull out after taking thousands of casualties in this. And so once that takes place, though, and it's over, the United States says, okay, we don't have any more interest in Afghanistan. And Afghanistan descends largely into chaos until eventually we're going to see that a fundamentalist Islamic government, the Taliban, assumes power. And so this Muslim nationalism, if you'll allow that thought to kind of sit there for a little while, is going to strongly appeal to a guy like Osama bin Laden, who was a Saudi of his own nationality, right? And he's going to come to blame the United States, particularly by the 1990s, for a lot of the problems in the world. He's going to refer to it often as the Great Satan, and you'll see that bin Laden is going to form this multinational terror syndicate called Al-Qaeda. It's going to be using Afghanistan and a number of other places as bases of operations, and he's going to declare war on the United States, attacking America or its possessions several times in the 1990s, and as you get closer to 2000, 2001, this is going to only escalate. Now, the United States doesn't really take this seriously for a while, and makes no appreciable response. Official U.S. policy under President Clinton was, well, this is a law enforcement issue. And we're going to find who blew these places up, and we're going to go and arrest them. Right? There's bin Laden in his sort of the height of his power. Right? One of his first attacks was to try to knock down the World Trade Centers in 1993. It fails. It blows a big hole in one of the World Trade Center towers, but it doesn't, knock him over like he had hoped. It would have to be another 8 years before they would do this. This is the Khobar Towers. U.S. Embassy in Africa is blown up by a bomb. This is the USS Cole, a U.S. naval ship that was attacked by one of those little pneumatic boats with bombs on it. I think 11 sailors or something like that were killed in this attack. Right? So when you look at these changes, all right, throughout the late 20th and then the early 21st century, a lot of these nations find themselves once again part of a much larger economic unit, but they are much more often ruled by democracy rather than the autocratic world that we would have seen at the beginning of the class. Although the overwhelming majority of the world is still autocratic. You're still looking at people that don't have a say in their government, right? Large multinational wars seem to be an unlikely event for the near future, right? You've got then terrorism and local wars that are going to be dominating the scene until something changes, right? A good example of this is September 11th in 2001, where Muslim terrorists under bin Laden's aegis, they destroy the World Trade Center towers in New York City and knock out one of the sides of the Pentagon near Washington, D.C. The U.S. has begun this war on international terror. Whether or not it's ending, not ending, right, is sort of the vagaries of the world. And so as economic freedom begins to spread to the autocratic world, can political freedom be long behind this, or you have terror and autocracy that are going to continue to dominate these parts of the world? And so this is the idea that we've got. Are we going to have these major events, these small sort of wars with these explosive kind of moments? Are we going to go back to the larger nationalistic kind of confrontations? The threat of the Cold War has been kind of removed. So what does the future hold is really, really hard to see. Is it going to be freedom? Is it going to be liberalism? Is it going to be socialism? Is it going to be nationalism? Is there going to be a successful movement in the future to find a way to fuse all of these together? Or is something new going to come in? So I'll leave you with that. Hopefully you've enjoyed the video series, and that will do it.